After being foundational for centuries, how do you remove God from Western thinking? Well, first, reject the obvious historical distortions in Christendom. Second, assault the validity of the Bible directly with hostile biblical criticism. Third, formulate plausible-sounding un-Bible stories for nature and history to contradict, discredit, and replace biblical explanations. Fourth, ridicule Christianity and sell the news stories to the public as the only possible reason and science explanations. It's called propaganda, and that is the subject of this video. And finally, redefine reason and science in terms of materialistic naturalism so that only atheistic explanations are considered scientific, and then God can be eliminated from rational and scientific discussions of reality by definition. At this point, it would be a good idea to understand what propaganda is. It is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Here are some of the more common elements used in the Enlightenment propaganda campaign. Reason and science made God and the Bible obsolete, no longer needed. Correct science requires that the supernatural be excluded. Evolution is the only reasonable explanation. Evolution is the new gospel, spiritually freeing people from superstition, slavery, and mythology. And the only people still holding on to God and the Bible are ignorant fools that hate reason, science, progress, and so on. First, God is obsolete and no longer needed. As I collected journal articles and books, I found that a number of leading Darwinists have not been silent about God at all, but have been trash-talking God for some time. In 1959, the grandson of T.H. Huxley, Julian Huxley, declared that Darwin had removed God as creator from rational discussion. No supernatural designer is needed, and there is no room for any supernatural involvement in life's development. And Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations for life superfluous or unnecessary. Darwin taught people to understand life in terms of naturalism. The supernatural or the divine are no longer needed, and Darwin provided intellectual fulfillment for atheists. Darwin did away with the reason for believing in a creator, for science makes God unnecessary, and physics can explain the universe without a creator. The textbook that my dad used for general biology opened with 30 pages explaining the necessary philosophy by which science must proceed. He asserted that the supernatural was outside the domain of science, and it cannot say anything about God. Well, traditional science recognized a limit to what science could study, but materialism defines what science can study as the limit of reality. The author went on to say that nothing concerning the supernatural has any value in science, and anyone still embracing the supernatural must believe that God has not exercised any direct influence within the universe once these natural laws were in operation. This is deism. God created and then has not been involved since creation. The prime mover in the universe is not the creator, but a set of physical and chemical laws. The author asserted that correct science demands that God be excluded from your thinking about nature. And if you don't view nature as a godless machine, then you are not a scientist. These guys assume that everything that has occurred is a natural event. So before political correctness, we had scientific correctness? Are they related? A physical anthropology textbook said that creation is an unacceptable explanation because it implies something outside of nature, thus violating a fundamental ground rule of science. But how does one know that everything that has occurred was a strictly natural event? And how do you know that the natural realm is the extent of reality, unless you have dogmatically embraced a philosophy that dictates that assumption? And what if a supreme being is the cause of something like the origin of life? If experiments to produce life from inanimate matter continue to fail decade after decade, will that question ever be open for reconsideration? Well, not if dogmatic atheism is more important than following the evidence. Evolution is the only reasonable explanation. It cannot be denied by reasonable people, and most enlightened people accept as a fact that everything has developed through evolutionary processes. Evolution is considered by all who are entitled to judgment, which means only those who believe it, to be a fact, and no further proof is needed. The evidence is so solid and comprehensive, and there are no weaknesses. Evolution can be denied only by those who have abandoned reason. And we're told that we owe Darwin a debt of gratitude for causing the whole world to believe in evolution, by which humanity was released from the spell of superstition that enslaved them, the myth of biblical creation, and the most important responsibility of geologists following Otten and Lyle is their impact on the spiritual lives of people, freeing them from the myths of biblical creation. The main conflict between science and religion can only be resolved when all religions accept that their worldview has nothing to do with reality. The only contribution science can offer to religion is atheism. And for those still not convinced, they throw in a dash of ridicule. If you still hold on to the idea of creation, then you are ignorant, dogmatic, and prejudiced. Not so sure about Darwinism? Then you're ignorant, stupid, insane, and maybe even wicked. Well, there have been calculated attempts to claim neutrality on God's existence as long as he is viewed as retired and not involved in nature in any way. The National Association of Biology Teachers issued an official position statement in 1995 in which they asserted that
the diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent with genetic modification. Evolutionary theory, indeed all of science, is necessarily silent on religion, and neither refutes nor supports the existence of a deity or deities.
Translated, we're not saying anything about the existence of God, just that he had nothing to do with the diversity of life on Earth. That's why those words unsupervised, impersonal, and natural were in there. Along with concocting imaginary nature stories to promote their philosophical viewpoint, Enlightenment advocates have also portrayed the Bible as wrong about everything, outmoded ancient mythology, and inherently opposed to knowledge and facts, even at war with reason and science. This warfare notion was fostered in books such as John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, published in 1875, and Andrew Dixon White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, published in 1896. Enlightenment advocates developed several standard tales that have been widely spread to support these beliefs. Christopher Columbus is portrayed as bravely standing up to the ignorant Christian belief that the earth is flat. The first episode of the new Cosmos series included a short animated story of the life of Giordano Bruno, portraying him as being persecuted and executed by the Roman Church because he believed the heliocentric theory, thought the sun was just a star, that other stars had planets, and many of those planets supported life. Shortly after this event, the Catholic Church turned Galileo over to the Inquisition for advocating similar ideas. Then people are told about the debate in 1860 between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Huxley. in which Huxley humiliated the bishop who did not understand Darwin's story. The 1960s movie, Inherit the Wind, portrays the 1925 trial in Dayton, Tennessee, in which Clarence Darrow defended a teacher named John T. Scopes, who was persecuted for teaching evolution in defiance of the law that had been passed forbidding the teaching of evolution. The names were changed in the movie, but Spencer Tracy played the part of Clarence Darrow, who was shown ridiculing and embarrassing William Jennings Bryan, leaving him sputtering as an ignorant, Bible-thumping fool as the trial ends. These stories have been used to spread the impression that Christianity is based on ignorance and is opposed to learning, evidence, science, and rational thought. Well, these stories make for great propaganda, but they are lousy portrayals of history and reveal that atheists are not above spinning secular mythology to promote their own dogmas and orthodoxy. The public has been told that the Bible teaches, and most Christians believe, that the earth is flat. This piece of Enlightenment mythology was produced by Washington Irving, who attributed the flat earth belief to the people of Columbus's time in his book, The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, published in 1828. He portrayed Columbus as a lone believer in a spherical earth, opposed by a united front of Bible-quoting superstitious dummies who were convinced that the world was flat. Actually, the round earth belief has been the general view of learned people, including Christians, for 2,500 years. Neither Columbus's crew nor the people of his time were very worried about them falling off the edge of the world. The real question concerned the size of the earth and the possibility of running out of drinking water before they reached land. Giordano Bruno did believe some things commonly accepted now, but most of these ideas were entertained by others in his time and were not punished as heresy. He did not come to these on the basis of evidence, but from claimed visions, and possibly from the writings of Thomas Digges. Bruno was not a humble truth-seeker, but sarcastic and argumentative, traveling around Europe promoting his ideas to others. He was not imprisoned and executed because of his cosmological beliefs, but because he claimed to be a Catholic, was a Dominican friar, and openly rejected most of the basic doctrines of Christianity. Both Bruno and Galileo faced the same inquisitor in Robert Bellarmine, but they were treated very differently, and for good reasons. Galileo was a disciple of Copernicus, and added to his heliocentric, sun-centered view of the solar system observations made through his telescope. The Church was not very interested in Galileo during the first 30 years of his intellectual activity, for this time was spent arguing with faculty of several universities, who were committed followers of Aristotle, and one of them even refused to look through Galileo's telescope. Church officials only became involved when university opponents complained to them that Galileo should be silenced because he was a threat to the Church. Actually, high church officials, including his inquisitor Robert Bellarmine, were investigating his science and even expressed a willingness to change church teachings if what he was saying proved to be true. But after 30 years of frustration, Galileo was not interested in being patient, and he pushed things to a confrontation. Even some of Galileo's friends urged him to back off and give church officials time to think about what he was saying. Powerful institutions don't like being pushed, so Galileo was disciplined by the Inquisition, but he was not tortured, locked away in a dungeon for years, or executed. Remember, the public has been given a story of this event written by Enlightenment disciples that want to paint the Church and Inquisition as much darker than it really was, and portray their view as pure objectivity and a noble search for truth. Galileo was imprisoned for 1 day, then released to spend the rest of his days under house arrest in a comfortable apartment where he continued his studies and was free to meet with guests and discuss his views. In 1860, Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, debated T.H. Huxley, and popular myth portrays Huxley as embarrassing a scientifically ignorant bishop. Actually, Wilberforce was a professor of mathematics and an ardent naturalist who had read Darwin's Origin of Species and written a lengthy critique which included criticisms that were being echoed by other scientists of his time. There was no published account of the debate for 30 years, and two eminent historians who have studied the accounts, John Hedley Brooke and J.R. Lucas, have concluded that the popular evolutionist version of what happened was later fiction. The Hollywood version of the 1925 Scopes trial has often been cited as evidence for the emptiness of Christian fundamentalism, but the 1960s movie, Inherit the Wind, was based on a 1955 stage play which the authors admitted up front was theatrical fiction and not history. The real event featured Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. The play and movie present a standard anti-Christian theme. Brilliant secularist, Darrow, demolishes ignorant Christian fundamentalist, Bryan, while John T. Scopes is portrayed as a sincere teacher persecuted for trying to teach science. Well, the Tennessee legislature had passed a law forbidding the teaching of evolution, but the real reason the trial occurred was that the ACLU wanted to fight it with a test case. So they met with Scopes, a math teacher, who had substituted for the science teacher a few times, and he agreed to claim that he had been hassled for teaching evolution. Rather than an ignorant fundamentalist blowhard, William Jennings Bryan was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson and one of the greatest orators in the country, known for his good character. He was much more conversant with evolutionary theory than Darrow, for he had actually read Darwin's Origin of Species and carried on a long-running correspondence about it with Henry Fairfield Osborn, one of the most respected evolutionists of his time. The transcript of the trial shows that it was actually Clarence Darrow, who had a poor grasp of Darwinism and bluffed his way through on some points with tremendous inaccuracy. Rarely heard is the legal maneuver that Darrow pulled towards the end of the trial. He wanted to examine Bryan on the Bible and agreed to then be similarly questioned about evolution afterwards. Well, Bryan fulfilled his part of the agreement, but as he finished his questioning, Darrow asked the court to find Scopes guilty, which ended the trial, so that he did not have to take the stand to be questioned about evolution, for Bryan would have shredded him. Some things confidently asserted as proofs for evolution in the trial were later found to be badly misinterpreted or outright frauds. The law was upheld, but the theatrical misrepresentations of the trial have been useful in portraying Christianity as an ignorant enemy of science. There's nothing new under the sun. The tactic of portraying God as opposed to human freedom, knowledge, and progress is actually the oldest trick in the devil's bag. In Genesis 3, 1-6, we see the serpent, beginning with a leading question, implying that God has excessively restricted human freedom. After the woman responded that what the serpent suggested was not the case, the serpent asserted that the threatened penalty of death would not occur and that God was, actually, just trying to restrict human knowledge and progress. Then Eve evaluated her surroundings by her own perception and reason alone, which is exactly what the Enlightenment was also committed to, removing God from the human understanding of the natural universe and reality so as to approach it totally by human reason. The advertising campaign has been effective. Science authorities telling people they need to eliminate God from their thinking and embrace their secular evolution stories because they are science explanations. It really sounds like secular dogma. And the apparently united voice of science was a major influence in moving the U.S. Supreme Court to begin eliminating the Judeo-Christian worldview from the public sector in rulings after 1960. Establish and promote that kind of a mindset within the education system and protect it from criticism, incompatible evidence, and alternatives by law as the only ideas allowed for consideration, and it's no wonder that these stories have spread, while Christianity has been in decline for decades. The intended result of the Enlightenment program was that the masses would reject God and the Judeo-Christian worldview in the belief that modern science had discredited that worldview.
I don't believe in God, first of all. Maybe because I grew up in like an age of science.